One of the hosts mocked Jesus on live TV, and while the audience laughed, Karoline Leavitt said something so calm and real, the entire room fell silent. It was supposed to be a lively debate on cultural values. The topic was faith and politics, messy, emotional, the kind of thing that draws ratings. But nobody in that studio was ready for what happened next. The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, millions of people were watching live. Seated at the far end of the table, Karoline Leavitt was composed, hands folded in her lap. She had been invited as a guest panelist, young, conservative, outspoken. She knew the environment was going to be hostile. She'd prepared for disagreement, maybe even sarcasm. What she didn't expect was the moment one of the co-hosts laughed and said, almost casually, "It's always the same. People bringing up Jesus when they run out of political arguments, like he's a campaign mascot or something." The studio audience erupted. The laughter echoed like a slap in a quiet room. One of the other panelists smirked and added, "Yeah, I'm sure Jesus is really concerned with tax brackets and border walls." Karoline didn't flinch. She just sat there, quiet, still. But then she leaned forward. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud. It didn't try to match their energy. That made it land even harder. "I think faith, real faith, isn't something to be mocked for applause," she said. "A lot of Americans, myself included, turn to Jesus not for politics, but for peace in times of chaos. It's not a punchline for me, it's how I survive." There was no music, no dramatic camera angle, just silence. You could see the change in the room immediately. The audience didn't quite know what to do. A few people looked at each other, unsure if they should laugh again or stay quiet. One host shifted in her seat and glanced at the producers off camera, maybe looking for a cue. Karoline didn't push further. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She just looked down, then back up again, as if to say, "That's all I needed to say." And that restraint, that silence, it was louder than anything that had been said all morning. The co-hosts tried to pivot. They cracked another joke. The discussion moved on, but the air in the studio wasn't the same. You could feel it. Something had landed, and people at home felt it too. Within minutes, clips of that moment were being clipped and posted. The show's own Twitter account hesitated to even promote the segment. But other pages, news commentators, influencers, faith groups, they weren't waiting. The soundbite started spreading like wildfire. Karoline Leavitt calls out The View Live on air for mocking Jesus. But the headlines missed the nuance. She didn't call anyone out. She didn't yell or shame anyone. She just spoke. And what she said hit a nerve. Back in the green room, after the show ended, Karoline sat on a couch alone. She was supposed to stick around for photos and a short post-show chat, but no one came in for a while. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Some texts said, "You did great." Others, not so kind. But she wasn't really thinking about any of that yet. Her mind was still back at the table, still hearing the laughter, still remembering how hard it was to say something, to push through the tightness in her throat, to speak her truth without sounding defensive. In that moment, she didn't feel like she'd won. There was no victory lap, no smug satisfaction, just a kind of emotional exhaustion. And still, she didn't regret a word, but she had no idea what was waiting once she walked out of that building. By the time Karoline stepped out onto the sidewalk outside the studio in Midtown Manhattan, her name was already trending. She didn't notice it at first. Her team had arranged for a car to take her to a meeting across town, but the driver was stuck in traffic. So she waited, arms folded, watching people pass by who had no idea what had just happened inside. Then her phone buzzed, again and again. Notifications were piling up, vibrating in waves she couldn't ignore. "Check Twitter now," read a text from one of her closest friends back in New Hampshire. When she finally looked, her stomach turned. Not because she was trending, but because of why. There were thousands of tweets, short clips, screenshots, hashtags, some praising her as brave, others mocking her expression, a few calling her a Bible-thumping fraud. One especially cruel comment said, "Another fake conservative crying over an imaginary friend." But it wasn't just Twitter. A Facebook group for Christian mothers had already shared the video with a caption that read, "This is what courage looks like. She didn't shout. She didn't insult. She just stood for her faith." On Instagram, edits of the moment were getting layered with soft music and captions in cursive fonts. Some were heartfelt. Others turned her into a meme, her face frozen mid-sentence. Words slapped across the image like, "When Jesus is your publicist." And then came the phone calls. First, a conservative radio host in Ohio asked if she'd do a segment that afternoon, then someone from a podcast in Dallas, then a Christian news blog, and after that, a booking agent she hadn't heard from in over a year suddenly texted, "Let's talk, you've got momentum." But the attention wasn't all opportunity. It came with venom, too. A well-known satirical account on X posted a parody clip mocking her tone, complete with a fake halo effect. One popular progressive influencer posted a video shaking her head saying, "This is what religious fragility looks like, folks." Karoline didn't respond. She just sat with it. By that night, cable news had picked it up. Fox News called it an unexpected defense of faith on hostile ground. MSNBC rolled the tape and debated whether her moment was real or rehearsed. A guest said it reeked of strategy. But those who knew her, they knew better. At a small diner in Scranton, Pennsylvania, an older couple who had seen the segment played it for their grandchildren at the dinner table. The grandmother wiped her eyes after. Finally, someone said it like a person, not a politician. In a break room at a warehouse outside of Mesa, Arizona, a young man named Julian watched the clip on his lunch break. He didn't consider himself religious, but something about the way Karoline spoke made him pause. It didn't feel like noise. It felt like something he hadn't heard in a long time. Sincerity. Meanwhile, Karoline was still processing. At home, she sat on her couch with a laptop open, skimming the reactions. Her hands trembled slightly as she read through hundreds of messages, some anonymous, some signed with names. One from a woman in Kansas stood out. "I walked away from my church 10 years ago because I got tired of people using God to hurt others. But watching you today reminded me of the real reason I believed in the first place. Thank you for being still in the storm." That one made her stop, made her lean back and close her eyes. For the first time since the show, she let herself feel something other than adrenaline. It was quiet now, but inside her, something was stirring. And yet, not everyone around her felt the same. One of her close colleagues texted her late that evening, "You should have let it go. It's just TV. Nobody cares." But the truth was, people did care. That's why it stung. That's why it spread. She hadn't gone on the show with a plan to make headlines, but sometimes a quiet moment has more weight than 1,000 shouting matches. But Karoline's story wasn't just what happened on live TV. It was the path that led her there. 3 days before the broadcast, Karoline sat in her kitchen in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, flipping through her notes. Her coffee had gone cold. The invite to appear on The View had come the week before, unexpected and with only a vague outline of the planned topics: faith, social values, the 2024 elections. She knew what that meant, politics dressed as a panel discussion, layered with sarcasm, sharp commentary, and subtle digs. She wasn't naive. She'd seen what happened to others who didn't toe the line. Still, something in her told her to go. Her mother had warned her, "You don't have to do this, Karoline. Let them talk. You don't need to walk into fire just to prove a point." But it wasn't about proving anything. Not really. It was about the silence that came when no one answered mockery with anything other than noise. She didn't want to be loud. She wanted to be real. The night before the flight to New York, she called her older brother, Trent. He wasn't political. He worked maintenance at a community college in Vermont and had zero interest in media wars, but he always kept her grounded. "They're going to try to rattle you," he said. "Let them talk. You know who you are. That's enough." She held on to that. In the green room at ABC Studios the morning of the show, she sat in a powder blue blazer, her fingers curled around a small bottle of water. Makeup artists passed by. Producers shuffled papers. One of the assistant staffers asked if she needed anything. She said no, but what she really wanted was 5 more minutes of quiet. When a senior producer walked in with the show run down, Karoline's eyes scanned it quickly. She saw the segment title, "Faith in Politics. Where's the line?" The host lineup was full. Sharp personalities, strong opinions, voices that filled a room. Karoline had done media rounds before, but this was different. This was live, and it was The View. The kind of space where grace got drowned out if it didn't come fast and loud. As they mic'd her up, she rehearsed nothing. She didn't prepare a comeback or memorize lines. She just reminded herself, listen, and speak if it matters. And then she was on set. The music rolled, the audience clapped. Lights hit hard. The segment started with laughter, not tension. The hosts joked about politics, peppered with buzzwords, extremism, outrage, moral high ground. It didn't take long for the conversation to veer toward religion. One host mentioned the rise of God rhetoric in campaigns. Another said, "It's always Jesus this, Jesus that," with a chuckle. And then came the line, "Jesus is not a campaign mascot, no matter how hard they try." The crowd laughed, loud. The panel fed off the energy, throwing in extra jabs. That's when Karoline felt it. That slow, rising feeling in your chest, when you know something has just crossed a line. She could have let it pass, could have nodded, smiled politely, and shifted the conversation. But that wasn't why she came. Not today. So she leaned forward and spoke. What most people watching didn't see was what happened right before she opened her mouth. Her fingers clenched slightly in her lap. She took a breath, her eyes locked on the person across from her, not with anger, but with a kind of stillness that felt harder to ignore than any raised voice. And then she said the words that now echoed across the internet. "I think faith, real faith, isn't something to be mocked for applause. It wasn't a performance. It was a choice. One she made in real time, without knowing if anyone would even hear her above the noise." And when the segment ended and the cameras turned off, the host stood, chatting like it was any other day. One of them smiled politely and said, "Thanks for coming, Karoline." She smiled back. "Thanks for having me." No drama, no fireworks, just two people playing two different roles. But what no one knew, what no camera caught, was how her hands shook just slightly when she went back to the green room, or how she closed the door behind her and exhaled like she hadn't breathed in half an hour. But the moment wasn't done with her yet. It was only just beginning to ripple outward. Karoline was used to opinions. Her inbox had been a battleground since her first campaign job at 22, but nothing had prepared her for this. By the next morning, she'd received over 400 emails. A few were sweet, many were bitter, and some were disturbing. The subject lines alone told a story. "Go cry to your imaginary friend." "You're what's wrong with America." Finally, someone with backbone. "I don't believe in God, but I respect what you did." She stopped reading them after the first 100, not because she was afraid, but because it got exhausting trying to separate the sincere from the toxic. Her phone lit up with text messages, not just from media contacts or strangers online, but from people she hadn't spoken to in years. College friends, old colleagues, a couple of distant family members. Some reached out to reconnect, others not so much. One message hit her hard. It came from someone she'd considered a friend, a woman she used to meet for coffee back when they worked on opposite sides of Capitol Hill. "You embarrassed yourself. You made us all look like zealots." Karoline stared at that message for a long time. She didn't respond. Not then. Maybe not ever. That night, she turned off her notifications and called her mom. She hadn't planned to talk about the segment, but within seconds her voice cracked. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," she admitted. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then came her voice, steady, soft, the way it always sounded when Karoline scraped her knees as a kid. Sometimes, when people don't know what to do with honesty, they throw stones at it. It helped. A little. Later that night, she made herself a bowl of pasta she didn't finish. She tried to watch something mindless on TV, but couldn't focus. Her mind kept replaying the moment. Not the words, she stood by those, but the aftermath. The noise, the strange tension between being praised and ridiculed by complete strangers. Around midnight, she opened her laptop, logged into a separate email inbox she rarely used, and clicked on a message with the subject line, "Thank you." It was from a man named Leon Sanders. He introduced himself as a 41-year-old single father from Twin Falls, Idaho. Not a politician, not a preacher, just a guy raising two boys and working night shifts at a freight company. He wrote, "I don't go to church much anymore, haven't in years. But when my 10-year-old son heard what you said, he asked me why people would laugh at someone for believing in Jesus. I didn't have a good answer, so we sat down and talked. For almost an hour. I just wanted to say thank you for giving me that moment with him. I needed it more than I realized." Karoline blinked back tears. That message? It didn't make the hate disappear. It didn't erase the frustration or the weight sitting on her chest all day, but it grounded her. It reminded her why silence wasn't always the noble option. Why sometimes you needed to speak, not to argue, not to shame, but to remind people that faith wasn't a joke and that peace wasn't a punchline. The next day, she got a request to appear on a primetime talk show. She declined. She needed space, not to hide, but to breathe. She went for a walk along the coast that afternoon, wrapped in a windbreaker, earbuds in, but no music playing. Just the sound of the tide and the crunch of gravel under her sneakers. A few people passed her, recognizing her face, but not stopping. She appreciated that. For once, anonymity felt like a gift. By the time she got home, there were more messages, some kind, some cruel. She didn't read them. Instead, she sat down, opened her laptop, and typed a short response to Leon Sanders. "You gave your son something real. That matters more than anything I said. Thank you." Then she closed the lid, made a cup of tea, and finally slept through the night. But while Karoline took a breath, others were preparing their responses, including the hosts of the very show where it all began. The following Monday, The View opened with tension you could feel even through the screen. The clip of Karoline's response had been watched over 12 million times across platforms. The producers couldn't ignore it, so they addressed it carefully. One host, the same one who'd made the original joke, spoke first. She didn't apologize. Instead, she offered a carefully worded explanation. Look, it was a joke about politicians, not about anyone's personal beliefs. It wasn't meant to offend, just to make a point. Another host chimed in. Faith is deeply personal. We all bring our values into the public sphere differently. Karoline made her point, and we respect that. But you could tell they were walking a tightrope, trying to acknowledge the firestorm without pouring more fuel on it. Karoline watched the segment from her living room. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel attacked either, just tired. The whole thing had taken on a life of its own, and now she was watching people she barely knew try to manage the fallout of a moment they hadn't expected. She could have gone back on television, could have done a victory lap on conservative networks, could have posted a long message framing herself as a cultural hero. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed quiet. She didn't want to feed the outrage machine. She didn't want to argue with strangers. All she wanted was to return to some version of normal and figure out what normal meant now. She still got texts and emails daily. She ignored most. But a letter arrived that week, handwritten, with no return address. Inside, it said, "I watched you sit in a room where nobody expected you to speak truth. You didn't flinch. I've kept quiet in my own life for too long. Not anymore. Thank you." That letter stayed on her desk. Meanwhile, pundits kept spinning the moment in every direction. Some said she was brave. Others said she was calculated. Some accused her of using religion to score points. Others said she was the only one who acted like a grown-up in the room. But none of those people knew how quiet her apartment got at night. None of them saw her pacing the floor, wondering whether her silence now was cowardice or wisdom. None of them saw the notes she kept writing and deleting from her phone. Drafts she never posted. Words like, "I didn't plan to say anything, but silence in that moment felt like consent." And, "Faith isn't a weapon. It's not for applause or headlines. It's a lifeline. That's all I was trying to say." She never posted them. They were for her. One afternoon, she met a friend for lunch in Manchester, New Hampshire, a woman named Kelsey who had once worked for a non-profit. The two of them hadn't spoken in months. Kelsey took one look at her and said, "You look like you've been carrying a boulder on your back." Karoline half laughed. "Feels about right." They talked for hours, about the show, about God, about how public conversations had stopped being conversations at all. Everything had become performance. Who could speak the loudest, the fastest, with the sharpest line? "I miss when people actually listened," Kelsey said. "You reminded people how rare that is." That conversation stayed with her. In the days that followed, Karoline returned to her quiet routines. Grocery runs, church on Sundays, long walks with her neighbor's dog. She didn't seek out new attention, but she didn't hide either. A small local news outlet reached out. Not for a soundbite, just a genuine conversation. She said yes. Not because she wanted to keep talking about The View, but because she realized something. The moment had never been about her. It was about the way people responded to conviction. How quickly we assume someone's sincerity is an act or their restraint is a trap. She had no control over the headlines, but she could control how she moved forward. So she chose stillness. She chose to listen. And slowly, the noise faded. But then came a call that would test everything she thought she'd left behind. It was a Thursday afternoon when Karoline's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. But a few minutes later, her publicist texted, "They want you back on The View, not a debate, a conversation. This time, you'd be on the main segment." Karoline stared at the message. She had already moved on, at least that's what she told herself. She had no appetite for another viral moment, no desire to become a talking point again. But something about the offer felt different. The tone was softer, less defensive, almost curious. That night, she called her brother. "You're not going back, right?" Trent asked, his voice half serious. "I don't know," she admitted. "They said it wouldn't be like last time." "Sure, and gas stations say their hot dogs are fresh. Doesn't mean it's true." She laughed for the first time in days. Still, the next morning, she said yes. Not for redemption, not for revenge, but because she believed in showing up, especially when it's easier not to. When she arrived at the studio, the energy was different, warmer. One of the hosts, who had been the most dismissive last time, approached her off camera. No cameras, no mics, just eye contact. "I rewatched the clip," the host said. "Didn't hit me the same way it did live. I was wrong to brush past what you said." Karoline didn't say anything right away, then she nodded once. "Thanks for saying that." This time she sat at the table without the same nerves, not because she wasn't anxious, but because she wasn't chasing anything. She didn't need to prove her faith. She just needed to be honest. The segment started slower than usual, less laughter, more listening. The host who opened the discussion didn't crack a joke. She asked a real question. "You said something that stuck with people, about real faith being about peace, not politics. Can you tell us what that means to you personally?" Karoline looked at the host, then at the audience, and then she spoke. "When I was 14, my dad lost his job. We almost lost the house. And I remember my mom sitting us down and praying, not because she thought God would fix everything overnight, but because she needed the strength to keep going. That's what faith has always been to me. Not a way to win arguments, a way to keep breathing when everything feels like it's caving in." You could hear a pin drop. The next question came, and then another. Nobody shouted. Nobody rolled their eyes. It wasn't perfect. There were still differences, awkward pauses, but it was a conversation. A real one. By the time the segment ended, Karoline felt something she hadn't felt since the first clip went viral. Peace. After the show, as she gathered her things backstage, a young production assistant stopped her. He looked no older than 20. "I grew up Catholic," he said nervously. "I haven't prayed in years. But when you said that about breathing, I don't know, it just made sense." She didn't preach, didn't quote scripture, just smiled and said, "That's how it started for me too." On her way out of the building, Karoline paused in front of the tall glass doors. A woman walking past her stopped suddenly and said, "Hey, you're that girl from TV." Karoline nodded gently. "I'm not religious," the woman said, adjusting her purse strap. "But you made me think, not about Jesus, about how I talk to people I disagree with. I've been terrible at it." Karoline thanked her. They both smiled. Then they went their separate ways. It wasn't a viral moment. It wouldn't make the headlines. But it mattered. But there was still one more thing Karoline needed to say, just not on TV and not for the cameras. 3 weeks passed. The noise had died down. The clips stopped circulating. The hashtags faded into newer controversies. Social media had moved on. But something in Karoline hadn't. Not because she was holding on to the moment, but because she hadn't quite finished living it. It was still inside her, in conversations with strangers, in late-night thoughts, and in a journal she kept by her bedside where she'd scribbled half-formed reflections and questions she wasn't ready to answer out loud. One Sunday morning, while sitting on a worn wooden pew in a small church outside of Concord, she realized something. It wasn't about what had happened on TV, not really. It was about what it revealed. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a victim either. She felt like someone who'd walked into a moment thinking she could stay quiet, and found that silence wasn't an option when something sacred was being mocked. Not for the sake of defending God, but for the sake of defending people who still believe they're allowed to hold on to hope without apology. That afternoon, she sat down at her kitchen table with a pen and a stack of blank note cards. No cameras, no publicist, just a quiet choice. She wrote letters, by hand. One was for the single father in Idaho, one for the young producer backstage, one for the woman outside the studio who admitted she'd been harsh toward people she disagreed with, and one for her younger self, the teenage girl who used to feel small and strange, for praying quietly before math tests, who would later find herself mocked for speaking about something so personal in a room full of laughter. She wrote, "You'll be misunderstood. That's going to happen. But speak anyway, not to be louder. Just to be clear, you're not speaking for attention. You're speaking because truth isn't always comfortable, and real peace doesn't need a spotlight." The last card she wrote was to herself, present day. It simply said, "You didn't flinch." She kept that one. Later that week, she posted something for the first time in days. It wasn't a video, not a quote, just a few quiet words on a blank background. Some things aren't meant to be defended with noise. They're meant to be lived, even when no one's clapping. No hashtags, no promo, just the words. Thousands of people liked it, a few mocked it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she said what needed to be said, and more importantly, she lived it when no one was watching. The lesson wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about owning anyone. It was about the cost of honesty and the grace of restraint. Because sometimes faith doesn't look like a sermon. Sometimes it looks like sitting in a room full of people who laugh at what centers your life, and choosing not to match their laughter, but to remind them that conviction doesn't always come with volume. It comes with stillness, clarity, peace, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. So if you're watching this, wondering whether it's worth speaking up, not to argue, but to be true to what grounds you, remember this. You don't need to be the loudest voice, just the clearest one. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe. Because in a world full of noise, we need more voices that carry stillness, truth, and a little bit of grace.